Hello and welcome to week 7 of American Government. In this chapter, we're going to talk about interest groups. Interest groups are pretty important in American politics, certainly not mentioned in the Constitution. Recently, they've taken on more importance in the last several decades. They're a little bit different than political parties in their structure and goals and what they want to do. Political parties are discussed in a different presentation this week. But they are very different entities, and interest groups don't have the same goals and mission that political parties do, but they are nonetheless important. The purpose of political parties is to get their members elected to public office so that they can shape public policy and actually run the government. They want us to hire them to run the government by voting for them in elections. Interest groups have a very different goal. They don't actually want to run the government, and they don't recruit members to run in elections. Instead, what they try to do is influence government policy from the outside by promoting their concerns with current government officials, trying to get those officials to listen to them and do what they want them to do. What they do in influencing the government can be somewhat controversial, but interest groups do serve a purpose, and they have ended up becoming an integral part of American politics. And we'll look at the things that they do, good and bad, during this presentation. Let's start out with defining what an interest group actually is. First, it's a voluntary association of people, just a group of people who get together. They have a common set of beliefs, interests, or values. So they have common goals, things that they are interested in, things they want to accomplish. And third, they focus on influencing government policy. That's really the reason they come together, is to convince the government to do something or not do something in accord with their beliefs and their policy goals. They can be focused on one issue or even an entire ideology. For example, an interest group might form whose only purpose is opposing a commercial turkey farm that wants to locate in a particular county. Corporate farming is somewhat controversial, especially if you live next to the stinky turkeys. So there might be an interest group formed just to lobby against allowing this commercial turkey farm to come in. A very narrow issue, very local in nature. On the other hand, we'll have groups like the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which pushes a wide variety of issues that they think are important to women. Of course, women are half the population, so that's a pretty broad thing, and they have a nationwide scope. They're active all over the country. So you might have something very local or something nationwide, very broad. So it can be very different in terms of what their beliefs, goals, and interests are and what they want to do. Whatever their goals, though, their purpose is to make government aware of their concerns and pressure the government into taking action. They're trying to convince the government to do something or not do something. Interest groups in one form or another have really been around since the very beginning of the country. This was recognized by the Founding Fathers. If you look at the First Amendment, they protected the right to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. And that's really all an interest group does, who gets together and tries to convince the government to do something because they're upset about something. So that's kind of the idea of an interest group. And so that was recognized very early on. We are a government of the people, of course, and the people have always been quick to band together in order to get things done. People tend to gather with like-minded people when there's something that comes up that they think is an issue that needs to be addressed. And so that's certainly no different in this country. And actually, we should be really grateful that we have those opportunities. If you look at other countries that don't have a democratic form of government, such as the Chinese government, for instance, in Beijing, they're a dictatorship, basically, where the right to assemble is not granted, and protests and other political activity is either completely forbidden or very highly restricted. And during the 2008 Olympics in China, the Chinese people, if they wanted to have some kind of protest and embarrass their government in front of the rest of the world who were watching the Olympics, they had to get a permit in order to do that. Of course, the government didn't issue any permits during that time, and so they basically outlawed any kind of protests, and so they do not allow their people to assemble and petition the government for the redress of grievances. And so we certainly have the ability to do that, but many governments don't allow it, because an authoritarian government, if they let people come together and try to influence policy, that would weaken the government's hold on power and threaten its control. And so we are very lucky to live in a democratic country where we can do things like this, and so certainly we shouldn't lose sight of that. In fact, our government depends on citizen participation to function. If people aren't willing to vote, run for office, serve on juries, and those sorts of things, our system breaks down. We need to have people be enthused and involved, and so we really depend on this. Our system relies upon people being participating in the process. So couldn't have more of a contrast there. But anyway, it's something that we should be grateful for, that we do have this ability to gripe to our government and band together in order to join our voices together as one in order to do that. Let's talk about the purpose of interest groups. What do they exist for? And actually, they play some fairly important roles in our political system. One thing that they do is that they keep individual voices from being drowned out. And certainly you can see how one person, in a country of 300 million or whatever, sometimes that's hard to get anybody's attention when you're doing that. But, we can band together in an interest group, you can make a lot more difference. Let's go back to our example that I mentioned earlier. Let's say that there's a corporate turkey farm moving into rural Jasper County somewhere, and you live in that area and you're upset about that. Well, you could certainly try to stop this farm from coming in on your own. You could call your county commissioners, you could show up at public meetings and speak about the issue. You might even call a lawyer and file some kind of lawsuit trying to stop it from happening. But what a one person can do is kind of limited. It's hard to get attention. Your chances of success would be a lot greater if you can get all your neighbors together and you show up as a group and you start sharing your concerns and trying to get public attention for things like that. And so that might give you a lot more success. You might be able to attract people to the cause who don't live next to you but are afraid that turkey farms will come to their part of the county in the future. People you don't even know might start getting interested if they see you and your group talking about this issue. You might attract environmentalists who don't have to live next to a turkey farm and don't really care about that as much, but just don't want the turkey poop in the environment, running into the creeks and streams and all that kind of stuff. So you might attract new people to the cause when they see your group doing this. So if you can get an organized group of people together, your voices are much more likely to be heard. You can stage protests, carry those signs around saying, ban the turkeys or whatever. TV cameras will show up and put you on the news if you have a whole group of people doing this. So working together as a group really gives your voice more of an impact than it would if you're just one person. And so interest groups give an outlet, for these kinds of things. And they really amplify people's voices so they won't be ignored. And so that's important, that the government pays attention to all of its citizens. And if you can get a group of people together, it's much more easier to get noticed. It's much easier to get your message out, attract new people to the cause, and that sort of thing. So if you're somehow organized, that will make your cause a lot more effective in all likelihood. Interest groups also provide an important means of participating in politics. And as we talked about, our system encourages citizen participation. Really, it depends on it. But not everyone wants to run for public office, and frankly, not everyone would be good at it if they did. Not everyone was cut out to be the governor of Missouri, or whatever the case may be, or become a legislator. And not everyone wants to go through that. Not everyone can afford to do that. That may be a financial sacrifice. But our system encourages people to get involved. And being a part of one of these interest groups provides a real easy way for ordinary people to get involved in shaping government policy without actually having to run for office and get elected to a government position. And it can be really easy. As an example, you may not feel qualified, to run for office and change government policy, but if you feel strongly about gun rights, you can join the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and pay a few dollars a year in membership dues. And then you have this group in Washington who is pushing the things that you believe in. It goes and talks to congressmen and senators and that sort of thing. And so your voice can be heard that way. You can be participating in the political process just by belonging to this group. And so this provides a way for people to get involved in politics and feel like they're making a difference without actually having to put their name on a ballot, and run an election. Interest groups also end up educating the public about important issues. Many people just don't have the time or the attention span to pay attention to all the important issues of the day that are going on. They may watch a little bit of news, but they don't really dive into the issues of the day and make sure that they're as well informed as they could be. But interest groups have the effect of raising the visibility of issues. And in fact, that's one of their purposes, is to inform the public about their concerns and try to build that support. They want more people to join their group, more people to support their cause, and so they'll try to get the word out. And so they'll have the effect of educating people about the issues that are facing the country. And so as a byproduct of what interest groups do, they end up raising the awareness of issues that are important to them. And so that makes people better informed citizens because these interest groups are out there trying to spread the word about whatever they're talking about. For an example, you might have some big issue out in the state of California involving migrant farm workers and their living conditions and things like that. And if you live across the country in New York, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't keep up on news in California. It might seem like a local issue, but if there's some kind of interest group that's trying to agitate, in the interests of those migrant farm workers, they might end up raising awareness. And so people across the country end up knowing about this, and that can end up building pressure on the government to do something, change some policy that is, that would help these people. And so an interest group can play an important role in kind of getting the word out and bringing the public's attention, focusing that on some issue that they otherwise wouldn't have even noticed. And so interest groups really do a lot to educate the public and bring up issues to the public's attention that might have been ignored otherwise. Not only do interest groups have the effect of educating the public, they can kind of educate the government too. They can bring some kind of obscure, not well-known issues to the government's attention. And the government certainly has a lot going on. It might not be aware of all the problems that its citizens face, or it might not have placed a very high priority on some of them because it's working on other things. And so an interest group, one of the things it's trying to do is to focus the government's attention on a particular issue and force it to take action and try to convince it to change a policy or to enforce some kind of policy, and that will further the group's goals. And so, for instance, in the example we used in the previous slide, the federal government might not be aware of the plight of migrant farm workers in California either, but an interest group that's interested in that will end up talking to congressmen and senators, people within the executive branch and the bureaucracies and agencies and things like that. And so they may end up getting the government actually interested in this issue that they either were ignoring or didn't have as a high priority before. And so interest groups have the effect of focusing the government's attention on things and kind of raising the profile of issues that they are advocating for. Interest groups also play an important watchdog role in ensuring that the government is doing its job, just like the media can do as well. For example, if the National Rifle Association thinks the government's promoting policies that hurts its membership, it will try to raise public awareness about that and try to build support for changing government policy. It will, try to get people enthused or angry or whatever. So they'll call their congressmen and try to get, people involved on things. And so they have the effect of kind of watching over government policy and trying to correct things that the interest groups think the government is doing wrong. And so they're kind of watching all our backs in a sense, making sure the government's doing what it's supposed to do. If the National Organization for Women thinks that some government policy is against the interests of women, it will try to raise public awareness about that, build pressure on the government to change its policy, call your congressman or whatever the case may be. And so they will kind of be keeping an eye on the government, making sure it's working in the interests of its people. And so interest groups can do a good job with that. They can make sure the government's taking care of its responsibilities. They will try to raise the alarm if the government's doing something it ought not to be doing. Let's talk now about types of interest groups. And the number of interest groups has really increased over the last few decades. And that's caused some controversy because they've had more influence than they used to. You'll hear politicians sometimes in political campaigns, they'll talk about the special interests that run Washington. And when they're talking about a special interest, what they really are talking about is an interest group. And interest groups, collectively have a larger presence than they used to and probably have more of an effect on government policy. So there are various different kinds that do different things. But overall, they've become pretty important to the way our government functions, and which has positive and negative effects. And so now we're going to just take a look at the different types of groups. The first one is economic interest groups. And these represent some kind of industry or profession and its interests. And so its members are bound together by some common economic concern of some kind. For example, we have the American Medical Association, which is a group of doctors, and they like to promote policies that they feel benefits their profession. They might be agitating for limitations on medical malpractice awards, for example. When you sue a doctor, how much money you can award against that doctor, to a patient who was injured or something. And so they'll be promoting government policies that help their profession. And so that, what they do for a living is really what binds them together. And certainly realtors, lawyers, and other professions also have groups that represent their interests of the government. You also have entire industries that have formed groups. For example, coal miners, car manufacturers have interest groups. Retail stores might form a group, that push their common interests, and so they might be in favor of certain legislation or opposed to certain bills that Congress is considering, or go and gripe about what different agencies are doing and that kind of thing. But they will basically try to convince the government to do things that help their industry. And so these groups are bound together by that common economic interest. We also have public interest groups, and these are designed to promote the public good in some way. And how you define the public good, of course, is kind of open to interpretation. But for instance, the Sierra Club is a pretty famous one of these, and they're agitating for a clean environment. And they want to stop pollution and save our forests and all that kind of stuff. And presumably that would benefit all Americans. They're not looking out for some little slice of society like realtors or something. They're broadly trying to help the public good as they see it, trying to protect the environment for the benefit of everybody in America. And so that would be an example of a public interest group. Some that we might classify as a public interest group may end up benefiting one group of people, but in a way that helps society as a whole. For example, the AARP, which I think it's just AARP doesn't stand for anything officially, but used to be the American Association of Retired People. And they represent the interests of retired and elderly Americans primarily. And so technically they don't represent all Americans, but certainly taking care of our senior citizens, is something that benefits everybody. If we have policies that are good to our older folks, that's going to help all of society. And so that's you could classify them as a public interest group because of that. And so however you want to define it, public interest groups are ones that are seeking to somehow promote the public good, however we happen to define it, basically for the good of everybody in the country. We also have a type of interest group called a think tank, and these are kind of interesting. What they exist to do is conduct research on issues of public interest. Once they do that research, they'll write papers and things like that, kind of like a university professor would, try to investigate things and write papers and get them published. But what they'll do, they'll present their findings and try to use their arguments to influence government policy. And many of these organizations are shaped by ideology. As an example, the American Enterprise Institute is one of these, and it's a conservative organization. It wants to promote freedom of business and free enterprise and that kind of thing. And if the federal government was talking about instituting a new tax, for example, there are economists, professional economists with PhDs that work for the American Enterprise Institute, and they might do studies focusing on the negative impact that this tax would have on American business. And then they would take those research findings and try to use them to persuade congressmen to vote against the tax. And so they do science, basically, but they have an agenda. They're trying to promote the policies that they feel are best and trying to protect their interests. And so they will use the science that they do. It's biased, in a sense, but they will try to use that to persuade the government to do certain things. And so we have lots of those think tanks that, they'll employ professional researchers and academics and things like that, but they will try to be promoting a particular point of view to the government to shape government policy. There are also interest groups that represent state and local governments even to the national government. There's a National Governors Association, and its aim is to lobby the federal government on behalf of state governments. And so if the federal government does something the states don't like, the Governors Association will get together and go talk to congressmen and try to get them to change their minds on something. So that's one example. We also have organizations for mayors and other local officials. There's a National League of Cities, for example, where municipal governments get together and try to shape national policy. So even government themselves can have these kind of interest groups working for them. Let's talk now about what interest groups actually do. How do they promote their interest to the government? How do they get it to try to change its mind? Well, there are many ways that they can try to push their agendas. One way is trying to lobby others to support their cause. And lobby just means try to persuade somebody, but have a chat with them and try to get them to support your cause, basically, is really what lobbying is. And there are a couple of different kinds of lobbying. The most controversial is what we call inside lobbying. And this means you directly talk to government officials who have the power to change government policy. So you're talking to the policymakers, the elected officials, or the bureaucrats, or whoever is in charge in Washington who's actually running the government. And so you're trying to get directly with them and get them to change their minds about something. Often this will involve actually getting time to sit down with a member of Congress or some government bureaucrat and actually talking to them, trying to persuade them, presenting your case to them, and trying to get them to do whatever you want them to do. To do this, groups may, just meet on their own, but they can also hire professional lobbyists who represent companies and interest groups for a living, and that's all they do. And they will voice their concerns to government officials. And these are just, professional people. Some of them have been in government before. They might have worked for a government agency. They might have actually, been elected to Congress or something. And then they will start a second career where they'll work as a lobbyist. And it's kind of like hiring an attorney, to represent your case. You can hire a lobbyist to go talk to the government and try to present your views and try to get them to change their policies. And so these are just professional advocates who work on behalf of interest groups and others trying to shape government policy. And this does present some ethical concerns. Professional lobbyists, they often develop a relationship with officials over time, some kind of personal relationship. They know the names of each other's kids and that kind of thing. They'll try to use that relationship. They'll try to buy meals for these people, give them gifts, do other things that might be considered ethical issues. There'll be some kind of conflict of interest maybe. And there are strict rules about this, about the kind of gifts that you can give a member of Congress from a lobbyist, and trying to keep everyone on the up and up. Occasionally, though, we'll hear of some kind of congressman who gets in trouble for this. And this used to be a problem like 20 years ago. There was some big issues around this, but haven't heard about it for a while. But once in a while, there will be some congressman who accepts money that they shouldn't accept, or favors. They'll take a free trip to Barbados or something, or accept other gifts from lobbyists. And so that could become a real problem for them. They'll look like they're corrupt, and maybe they are. But either way, it doesn't look very good, and so that can cause them some real issues. And, there's a concern about giving these groups an inappropriate level of influence. After all, these people that we send to Washington, they're supposed to be representing all of us. And so if there's some group, that can hire a lobbyist and, to go put pressure on this congressman for the benefit of some small interest group, that may come at the expense of the rest of us. And so people are kind of worried about that. So that's why interest groups can be controversial. Interest groups can also form political action committees, or PACs, as they are called. And these are organizations designed to help get people elected to office who are sympathetic to the group's views. And so rather than try to just influence people who are in government, they will try to get people elected to the government who support the interest group. And so they'll try to help with their election. PACs can do this a couple different ways. They can give contributions to the campaigns of congressmen, for example, who will vote in favor of the interest group's agenda. And so if Congressman Smith, supports this interest group, the PAC formed by the interest group can give some money to Congressman Smith's campaign to try to get him reelected. And so they will try to get people elected who actually support their views to begin with. They may also run political ads in a race, trying to get someone elected or trying to defeat the opposing candidate. And so they will directly intervene in the election, trying to convince people to vote one way or the other. To do this, they can form what was called a 527 group. And this is, the name of this comes from a federal statute, section 527 of the U.S. Code somewhere. And so they can form a special group, and the purpose of which is to run these political ads and participate in the campaign. And the law allows groups to do this, to run ads for or against particular candidates, so long as they don't coordinate their efforts with that candidate's campaign. And so the 527 group couldn't sit down with Congressman Smith's campaign manager and say, okay, what ads do you want us to run and how often? They can't do that, but they can run ads that support a candidate or, oppose the opposing candidate. And so they can actually directly intervene in an election trying to get people to vote one way or the other in favor of their candidate that they like or against the candidate that they don't. Interest groups can also do what we call outside lobbying. We saw the inside lobbying where they may get the lobbyists and actually go talk directly to the government officials. Outside lobbying is different than that. Instead of appealing directly to the government officials in person, outside lobbying appeals to the public and tries to get the public to appeal to the government. And so they'll try to convince just the general population to get enthused about whatever the interest group is interested in, and then try to get the government to change their mind that way. The goal is really to change public opinion to support the group's cause, and the government usually responds to the will of the people in one form or another, and so if we can change the will of the people, we can get the government to change its policies, is the idea. This can be very effective. You would think that inside lobbying would be much more effective, and maybe it is, but outside lobbying can work too. As an example, a few years ago, about 2007 or so, there was a controversial immigration bill that Congress was considering, and it looked like it was going to pass. But some groups called for members of the public to write and call their congressmen and ask them to vote against the bill, and they did such a good job at that, Congress was just flooded with angry phone calls from people who didn't want that bill to pass. And so congressmen were kind of afraid, if this many people really hate this bill, I don't want my name attached to it. And so it actually killed the bill. And so it really had a massive effect on government action and policy. And so outside lobbying can be very effective if we get the just ordinary people to get involved and make their opinions heard. Outside lobbying is often spoken of as trying to get the grassroots involved in an issue. And if you hear that term, the grassroots, that's just a way of saying that the goal is to get ordinary people involved. The grassroots is just, that's the kind of ground level, I guess. It's just the common ordinary people, who go and vote and that sort of thing. So, not the elites, but just the everyday folks, trying to get them involved, trying to influence government policy. And there are different ways that interest groups try to reach those grassroots and try to get ordinary people involved. One is direct contact. They may actually try to just talk directly to the members of the public. They may call. I've had plenty of phone calls in my day, people trying to get me, enthused about some bill or something that's before Congress, trying to get me to call my congressman or whatever. They may send out mail, and they may actually go knocking on doors, that sort of thing. So that's one way they can do that. Other ways, they can hold demonstrations, which are just protests. They'll get in front of a camera usually and wave signs around, trying to bring attention to their issues. And that can get people's attention, get them interested in the issues, and change public opinion. Internet blogs are something that are pretty popular, and other forms in the media. They'll try to get on TV or the radio or something, however they can. But the internet is certainly playing a more important role all the time in getting the message out on these things. But if you're really trying to reach new people, if you start a blog, you'll probably end up with a lot of people who are already interested in that issue to begin with. And so whether it can reach new people or not, it's kind of an open question. You may be preaching to the choir rather than actually reaching new converts. But certainly they'll try to get their message out to the public at large in any way that they can. Once in a while, an interest group will try to organize what's called a boycott, where they will attempt to persuade the public to avoid buying some company's products. And once in a while this is effective, usually not that much. Honestly, it takes, for a large company, it would take a huge section of the public to stop buying their product in order to really have an effect. But say, for example, the Sierra Club, which cares about the environment and loves the trees and that kind of thing, let's say they got mad at some soap company for dumping too much pollution into the environment. Well, they could try to organize a boycott and persuade people to stop buying that company's products. And if enough people did, that company would start losing sales, and it would be hurting them in the pocketbook, and so they might change what they're doing. And so that's another way that interest groups can actually reach people and try to change policy. A lot of things that interest groups do cost money, sometimes a lot of money, and so they will spend quite a bit of time trying to raise funds. They can do that a number of different ways. They may charge membership dues from their members and even ask for contributions. We mentioned the National Rifle Association earlier. They charge, several dollars a year to be a member of the NRA. And in addition to that, they may send out appeals to their membership saying, oh, please, we're trying to do, X, Y, and Z, won't you send us some money? And so they will try to raise money from their membership. And so, however they do it, fundraising is very important because running things like TV ads and supporting political candidates, that's very expensive. And so a lot of things that interest groups do involve raising money to support their cause, and that's become pretty important. Well, are interest groups a good thing or not a good thing? That's a matter of quite a bit of debate. Interest groups are very controversial. We already mentioned that people talk about the special interests are running Washington. The interest groups have too much influence is really what they're saying. And there's an argument for that. Limiting their access to public officials, that's a perennial campaign issue. And you can understand, if you elect a senator or a congressman to Washington, how much do you think they ought to be talking to these special groups and their lobbyists and things like that? Should they just be paying attention to you and just common people, out in the world, or should they be, meeting with these lobbyists and hearing what they have to say? There's a real issue about how much access interest groups ought to have to public officials. The people who oppose the power of interest groups point out that these groups don't represent all of us equally. If you have the AMA, the American Medical Association, that just represents doctors, well, I don't know about you, but I don't have a lot in common with a lot of doctors. And so if they hire a lobbyist to go talk to a congressman, they're going to be paying attention to some very small slice of the electorate, of their constituents that they're supposed to be representing. And hopefully they won't overlook the interests of everyone else, but certainly if they're paying that much attention to a small slice of society, the potential for overlooking everyone else is real. And certainly our elected officials are supposed to be looking out for everybody, not just whoever's represented by these groups. But the groups tend to amplify the voices of a few people and allow them to have a disproportionate impact on government policy. When you band together into one of these groups and raise a little bit of money, you can have an impact that's kind of greater than your actual numbers sometimes. And so public officials might be paying more attention to one of these groups than their numbers would really maybe warrant. And so they can have more of an effect than the general public would. Interest groups also normally represent politically sophisticated people. And so they can be seen as representing the elites in society, the rich and the powerful, the well-connected, and that kind of thing. And certainly we don't want the government to pay attention to only those folks and ignore the rest of us. And so people sometimes see interest groups as kind of promoting that elitism, trying to get the government to do things that just help these special interests, as we say, rather than everybody as a whole. And so that can be a fear. And people argue that ordinary people will see all these industries and political groups having access to government officials, and as a result, the common people will feel like the government doesn't really work for them, it just works for these groups. And so if we let them have too much influence, they'll just feel left out, and we don't want people to feel disconnected from their own government. We require their participation. They're going to the polls and running for office and all those kinds of things in order for our governmental system to work. And so we don't want them to feel left out, basically. And certainly that could happen if they feel like the government's really not listening to them, it's just listening to the interest groups. That could kind of turn them off, make them feel apathetic about government. My vote doesn't matter. It's just all these groups that are running the government anyway. And so there is a danger of letting them have too much influence. And so that's really why they're so controversial. However, there is an argument for that they do a lot of good, and we've looked at some of the things that they do already. They provide an opportunity for ordinary people to get involved in public affairs. That's kind of the flip side. If you want to change government policy, all you have to do is join one of these groups. Pay your membership dues and get the newsletter and whatever, and you'll feel like that you have a voice in government. They'll bring some important issues to our attention and educate people and the government about things. And they serve as a government watchdog, as we saw in our examples. And so there are some good things that they do. And there's certainly an argument to be made both ways, whether they're mostly helpful or mostly harmful. That's something you can decide for yourself. Certainly they do good things, and they are some concerns about them as well, so they kind of cut both ways. But however you feel about them, it's undeniable that they are an important part of our political system now and the way that things work. And so we certainly deserve to give them a little bit of our attention. So, well, that's it for interest groups. We have a lot going on this week. We're talking about political parties and also the election process. So be sure and pay attention to that as well, and I'll see you next time.